Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And first of all, my thanks to Effie and Joanna for organising this wonderful conference and for the invitation to speak. And to Ruth for starting our session with such a really, really interesting paper. And there's so many resonances with what I'm going to say as well. So it's a really, really good start. Thank you. And I'm interested in sort of mechanisms, cultural mechanisms and ideologies and discourse within institutions, and particularly within psychiatric institutions, and how they can facilitate and obfuscate and provide sort of mechanisms for denial, if you like, of different forms of abuse, including sexual abuse. And while I was preparing my paper for today, I reread an American article that was published in 1968 titled "Unexpected Effects of an Open Door Policy on Birth Rates of Women in State Hospitals," by which they were referring to mental or psychiatric hospitals, and I'm going to use that term interchangeably. And it very much resonates with material I used in an article that I published last year on what happened when wards in large psychiatric hospitals were unlocked during the 1950s and 60s, allowing men and women to mix unchaperoned for the first time. So in terms of this American article, it's the word unexpected that is so unexpected for me, looking at this from a sort of 21st century or even a post-1970s and 80s perspective. Because to my mind, opening doors and allowing men and women to mix either in the hospital or in the community would inevitably lead to sexual activity, some of which would not be consensual. And of course, within this particular context, the issue around consent and mental capacity is fraught with complexities. So in this paper, I'm going to explore how certain ideologies that were circulating at the time, certain practices, were allowed to take place within a specific type of community, the psychiatric hospital, and the lack or failure of intervention to protect vulnerable women. And this is not to ignore that sexual abuse was perpetrated towards men, but in this context, women were particularly exposed. So I'm going to begin by explaining the significance of unlocking doors in psychiatric hospitals, together with resistance to this huge cultural change that took place, mainly from male nurses, actually. I'll then show how the consequences of opening the doors, sexual harm primarily, gradually began to sort of dawn on hospitals, on the medical staff and the administrative staff during the 1970s, but by that time it was too late to change. So just to provide a little bit of context, in this post-war period in 1948, when the NHS took on responsibility for running mental health facilities in England and Wales, a young man, his name was Eric Pryor, joined Claybury Hospital in northeast London as a student nurse. He'd recently been demobbed from the army, and along with so many men in that immediate post-war period, was looking for work. When he arrived at Claybury Hospital, he was shocked by what he saw. He likened the wards to a, quote, Dickensian workhouse. He described a regimented discipline of staff clocking in and out, of drab state-issue patient clothing, and a huge building in a state of war-wounded shabbiness. So Claybury was fairly typical of psychiatric hospitals during that post-war period. Many were horrendously dilapidated and broken down. Patients were living in terrible conditions, locked into understaffed single-sex wards. And actually, they had started to sort of change that before the war, but when the war came along, all the doors were locked again in wards. And overcrowding was a very, very serious problem, and much of that was due to an accumulation of older long-stay patients. So it became clear that these mental hospitals were going to have to close. But by the mid-1950s, there were over 150,000 people living inside them, and that's just in England and Wales. Organising suitable accommodation for so many in smaller community homes was going to take decades, which it did. And this sort of followed years of turmoil and upheaval in the whole sector. And the actual hospitals didn't begin to close until the 1980s. So whilst all of that was happening, attention began to turn to improving condition inside the hospitals. And a number of medical superintendents, who were the senior doctors, who had an enormous amount of power and ran the hospitals, they began to instigate changes that moved away from the sort of rather prison-like, very hierarchical structures towards more therapeutic communities. And they weren't all like that, but some of them were. And because so many patients have been living inside these institutions for years or often decades, they were psychologically ill-equipped to leave hospital and live in the community. Rehabilitation programs were developed in which patients were encouraged to think for themselves, to make their own decisions, to interact meaningfully with others, and to look after themselves. And for many, this was the beginning of that very long journey from the hospital from the hospital ward into the community home. And this new initiative was given added momentum from the mid-1950s by the introduction of the new neuroleptic antipsychotic drugs, which in theory meant that people didn't need to be in hospital any longer because their symptoms could be controlled, which meant that they could actually leave hospital and live in the community. So that liberalisation of hospital committal was legitimised by the 1959 Mental Health Act. And crucially, it put the power of confinement in a mental institution primarily into medical hands, whereas before often it required a magistrate to commit people. So it became much, much more medicalised. Patients who went voluntarily into psychiatric hospitals did so on the same informal basis as they would enter a general hospital, and they were at liberty to discharge themselves at any time. So together, these changes represented the beginning of the deinstitutionalization process. And if you'd like to read more about that in Greece, Despo Kritsotakis has written quite a lot about that movement in Greece. That's the book, which is a very good edited volume.
That's Despo.
Sorry?
So you know that Despo's here?
Oh, is she? Yeah. Where? Oh, okay, good. A name check. One of the most radical and symbolic changes that began to take place from the early 1950s was the unlocking and opening of ward doors. This allowed, so before that, really from the early 19th century, these institutions would be absolutely rigidly segregated, not only in terms of patients, but also in terms of staff. But in that post-war period, they started to allow men and women to mix, to leave their wards and to mix with each other unchaperoned for the first time. And this move reflected guidance from the WHO, which stated, oops, hang on, sorry. Yeah, which stated, life in the hospital should be modelled on life within the community in which it is set. In a Western country where men and women mix freely at work and in recreation, it is obviously desirable that they should do so when in the mental hospital. In a country where men and women use the same restaurants, it is obviously ridiculous that sexes should be segregated for feeding in the hospital. So, as I mentioned, not every hospital opened every ward door. How the deinstitutionalization process unfolded was left to the discretion of the medical superintendents. Some were more progressive in their thinking than others. Most kept 1 or 2 wards closed, normally for female patients who were believed to be particularly vulnerable. So there was some thought and awareness around what might happen when they opened the doors, but it tended to relate to women who were in very acute stages of being unwell, rather than to women who were on long-stay wards. So there was opposition to opening the doors in a sort of very wholesale way, and that especially came from male nurses who were worried that a dramatic removal of institutional fetters would set patients on a course of violence and destruction, which didn't happen. Indeed, open doors were reported to be beneficial, and of course the old argument, especially for male patients, who were believed to behave better when women were around. Reduced violence, less spitting, less swearing, and they took more care of their appearance. One charge noted how he hoped mixing the sexes would reduce male patients' tendencies to homosexual behaviour and divert relationships into, quote, more normal channels. So it's the 1950s, all doors are beginning to open, patients of both sexes are moving around large institutions which are overcrowded, understaffed, and full of unmonitored spaces. So what about sexual activity? How consensual was it? To what degree did women experience sexual harassment, touching, looking, and rape? So I found in the literature very little discussion between doctors on how the move towards mixed-sex living might expose women to sexual harm. As I've mentioned, some women who displayed hypersexuality as a temporary symptom of more treatable illnesses were protected in locked wards until the acute stage of their condition had passed and they could be discharged back to family life. So these were women who were often seen as sort of respectable women, really. But little consideration appears to have been given to other women, especially those who had been in the hospital for many, many years. And it was actually, as I say, the male nurses who began to draw attention to how open doors could leave women vulnerable to sexual assault in the 1960s. But they did have other motivations for doing so. Some of them were furious with doctors for implementing a policy which they, the nurses, had to carry out. And they accused doctors of, quote, seeking the limelight by trying to be first in a fashionable field, and for trying to look progressive. Whilst they may have had the interests of female patients in mind, many of these men were against working with female patients and nurses. Over decades, they had developed ingrained homosocial ward cultures that were based on a military-style hierarchical discipline. Some harboured fears that they would be subordinated to female nurses and subjected to what they called a petticoat government. They also voiced concerns that their careers would be damaged by false accusations of sexual assault by hysterical females. And this, Dimitri, this idea of lies and not believing comes up again. So male nurses militating against mixed-sex wards was in part a response to a broader shift in the patient population of the large psychiatric hospitals. The number of older people reduced as patients either died or moved to smaller residential homes. Instead, younger, more sexually active people were coming into hospital for short stays, sometimes for just a few days, to have their medication monitored. Resident numbers fell, but admission numbers rose. In addition, so-called criminal psychopaths, some of them sexual offenders, were being sent by the courts to open psychiatric hospitals because there were not enough secure forensic beds in special hospitals like Broadmoor, Rampton and Moss Side. And these patients tended to be unpopular both with patients and with staff. They could be disruptive and had to be watched. So if there were locked wards, they were usually for women. So if men who were seen as being dangerous were admitted, then staff had to sort of watch them all the time. Because they were obviously seen as being threatening. So some women, particularly if they were heavily medicated or experiencing the after effects, for example, of some treatments such as ECT, were particularly vulnerable. This was confirmed by one harrowing testament of a woman patient who had been raped by a male patient who had been admitted from prison. "I was high," she said. "ECT makes you peculiar. It was a very spaced out time." So similar moves in terms of deinstitutionalization were taking place in America, where the number of residents in the giant, enormous state and county mental hospitals more than halved from over 500,000 in 1955 to over 250 15,000 about 20 years later in the mid-70s. And to return to that 1968 study I mentioned at the beginning, called Unexpected Effects of an Open Policy on Birth Rates of Women in State Hospitals, the authors reported how they had encountered one, quote, unanticipated and previously unreported side effect of these generally beneficial changes, i.e. open wards, a side effect of serious concern, they wrote. They were referring to a 366% rise in the birth rate in Michigan's major state mental hospitals. The increase in pregnancies, they believed, was probably, quote, due to the open door policies resulting in the widespread use of neuroleptics, which could manage and alleviate psychotic symptoms. So the number of deliveries of women who were resident in the hospital, but who could move around the hospital and go in and out into the community, rose from 29 in a sort of 5-year period in the mid to late 30s to 143 from the early 60s to the mid 60s. So that represented a rise of 17 rising to 16 per 1,000 fertile, as they said, women, fertile age women over these 5-year periods. And these numbers do not include women who gave birth outside the hospital, only the severely ill or the financially restricted who delivered in a state hospital. Of 112 infants delivered at one of the hospitals with good enough records, and a huge criticism was that very few records were being kept of what was happening to women or their children. Sorry, what's that number? 29% went to relatives, 38% to foster or adoptive homes, 4% died, and there was still 29%, they didn't know what happened to those children. The study suggested that in the main, the children were unwanted, citing, quote, similar ominous implications for future generations, implying passing on a genetic inheritance. Various other reasons were given that may have contributed to this rise in the birth rate, such as younger patients, that the patients, women were younger, more younger women were going in, and that conception had taken place outside the hospital, both of which are plausible. They argued that effective contraception should be made available to the patient and her spouse when she re-enters the community. So what then might explain the apparent failure of medical staff to consider the sexual harms to the wider female patient population brought about by the new open door arrangements? Well, it's really obviously a very complex issue, because unlocking ward doors and liberating ward spaces whilst those big institutions were still there had to be a good thing. But in a climate where patients were being encouraged to form more normative relations with members of the opposite sex, deciding who should and should not be in open wards for reasons of controlling their sexual behaviour was fraught with questions around mental capacity, consent and human rights. There tended to be less focus on vulnerable patients and risk, as we might think about that now, and more focus on dangerousness, which was applied to sort of individuals. So I mentioned earlier men coming in from the courts. So while this period was going through, you know, the NHS and the whole provision of mental health care was going through sort of enormous upheaval in the provision of services, I want to focus today on attitudes towards sex and sexuality. So one explanation for a general blindness when it came to sexual activity between patients might be doctors' ignorance of or aversion to non-normative sexuality that occurred outside marriage. From the 1960s, there was a lot of bad press about mixed-sex wards, particularly because they were seen to provide men and women with the opportunity to have sexual relations in hospital, threatening marriages and family units. Staff were perfectly aware that patients were having sex, but unless these relationships became obviously problematic, they tended to turn a blind eye. Dennis Martin, the superintendent in Claybury Hospital, admitted in the vaguest possible terms that, quote, "We can only take steps when an undesirable association comes to our notice." In the 1960s and 70s, many staff, including doctors, were still fairly ignorant of matters around sexuality. In 1969, one doctor stated that, quote, "Doctors are confused about sex. Most people get their family planning advice not from their doctor, but from their barber." The journalist, Gerda Cohen, conducted a survey of English hospitals during the early 1960s and suggested that doctors found discussions around sex distasteful and embarrassing. To prove her point, she explained how at a weekly case conference, a nurse observed that the male patient they were discussing, the so-called case, has got a crush on that psychopath, by which she meant the female patient, in 12. She won't do him any good, she said, she's a right tart. And the junior doctor who was listening to this responded with a stifled titter. So he laughed with embarrassment, suggesting that he was embarrassed around the whole mention of sex and sexual relationships. In America, only 3 of 114 medical schools were teaching human sexuality in 1960, and that number actually rose to 106 by 1974. Nursing schools lagged behind, focusing more on reproductive biology. And even by the 1980s, staff were given little training on the subject and found it difficult to discuss in terms of that were anything but negative. From the 70s, change began to take place. These were in part precipitated by a raft of abuse inquiries which exposed the appalling conditions in which patients were living in hospitals. So more staff were employed, they were better trained, they generally had a better education. Conditions were improved, and of course feminism, other human rights and patient movements began to draw attention to women's vulnerability and sexual harm. One of the important achievements of feminism was to provide women and men with conceptual frameworks and a vernacular vocabulary that could help them to give meaning to and articulate how acts of sexual violence have been perpetrated against them. And I think that's something, Effie, you mentioned at the beginning about finding languages. One sociologist, Joan Busfield, wrote that, quote, "Women have often had very narrow definitions of rape and have been reluctant to define sexual intercourse with friends or spouses under coercion as rape." Historian Lucy Delap has argued that there was a language in which abuse could be articulated before the late 60s, but it was, quote, "more easily adopted by policymakers and commentators than by victims and survivors." So I think this language is a really important thing to discuss. From the 1960s, reports of rape more generally in society did begin to increase, partly as a result of better reporting facilities, partly due to the encouragement and support of feminists. And of course, Joanna has written a lot about this. Yet many psychiatric inpatients, especially those on long-stay wards, didn't want to speak up, knowing that making a complaint could have serious repercussions. A 1980 DHSS report claimed that patients were reluctant to object to mixed-sex arrangements due to, quote, "embarrassment, fear of seeming ungrateful, and nervousness about possible reprisals." One senior male charge nurse commented in the 1970s that patients did not like to protest about mixed-sex wards because they would be labelled troublemakers, and that could make their lives on the ward very, very difficult. But campaigns against mixed-sex wards started to gain momentum, not only in psychiatric hospitals, but in general hospitals too. However, by the time they really started to attract political attention, it was really too late by then to start thinking about returning to single-sex wards because they weren't economically viable any longer. All the sort of funding structures had changed to facilitate mixed-sex wards, and that's still going on at the moment. When the AIDS crisis took hold from the mid-80s, staff could no longer turn a blind eye to sexual behaviour, heterosexual, homosexual, consensual or otherwise. And responsible measures had to be taken by government and healthcare workers to, quote, inquire more closely into individuals' sexuality and sexual behaviour. How much was actually done, I think, is not that clear. But in the 80s, some clinicians were beginning to speak up too. One anonymous psychiatrist wrote to the British Medical Journal in 1988 to share the results of a small survey conducted among 12 women, most of whom had been inpatients on an acute mixed-sex ward. He or she reported that, quote, 5 had experienced unsolicited sexual advances while in hospital, 1 woman had been raped in a lift, another stated that she had been raped twice. The psychiatrist contended that most staff trained in psychiatry will have witnessed patients becoming uncharacteristically libidinous and promiscuous as a symptom of manic illness. The vulnerability of acutely psychotic patients to unsolicited sexual advances is recognised less often. It is easy and comforting to dismiss these examples as the elaborated fantasies of crazy patients or to claim that the victims were provocative. So, he or she insisted that if not, and of course that person was anonymous, and insisted that if nothing was done, patients would continue to be at risk. So in 1992, the mental health charity Mind raised concerns about the potential for sexual assaults on women in mixed psychiatric wards, even though they stated that rape was rare. They lobbied the Department of Health for a number of measures to be put into place. So this is now, we're in the 90s, sort of 30 years really after mixed-sex wards started to open. So they lobbied for these measures, which were policies in all mental health units to cover harassment, abuse and rape, staff to be trained to know what constitutes a crime, when the police should be called and what sort of forensic evidence would be required, patients to be made aware of their rights. Additionally, they called for all women to have the right to choose whether they wanted to enter a woman-only or mixed wards. And some women did prefer mixed wards and do, and it very much tends to depend on which stage they are in their recovery. In the following year, in 1993, perhaps in response to that Mind campaign, a series of short articles was published in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry to inquire into how staff dealt with sexual activity between patients in hospitals in a number of different countries. My thanks to Joanna for drawing that to my attention. In England, according to Andrew Payne and Sally Hardy, sexuality was still, quote, a difficult subject for both patients and staff to discuss. Victorian attitudes prevailed. Sex education, quote, and counselling about contraception, safer sex and drug use have only been attempted in a haphazard and superficial manner on acute psychiatric wards, they wrote. So that's the early 90s. But writing of the 1980s, they claim that staff were still given little training on sexual matters and found it difficult to discuss. They concluded that, quote, sexual relationships between patients or between patients and their visitors are prevented, discouraged or ignored to the extent that patients are sometimes forced to have intercourse in the hospital grounds in winter, as the wards are deemed by staff to be unacceptable places for such activity. Private areas for sex are not provided on acute psychiatric units. Condoms were available, but patients had to ask staff for them. To conclude, in this paper, I've attempted to outline the circumstances that led to opening mental hospital doors and liberating spaces in the post-war period, revealing some of the so-called unexpected or unanticipated consequences of such policies. Vulnerable women who could be exposed to sexual harm, sexually transmitted diseases, and unwanted pregnancies. And even though some measures were taken to protect very unwell women, how might we explain this larger blind spot? So before the mid-70s, sex between patients was discussed in relatively benign language, not in terms of violence and harm. Doctors and nurses tended to be ignorant of sexuality and to understand sexual activity between patients within the mores of the day. These focused on unwanted pregnancies, the breakup of marriages, and sort of protecting so-called respectable married women during a manic phase. Bodies, as Joanna Burke, amongst others, have argued, are discursively constructed as sexual. They can also be constructed as asexual, or they can be desexualized, creating a culture in which society, including sexually ignorant and professionally isolated doctors, might not have believed certain female patients were vulnerable to sexual abuse because they didn't see them as sexual. For example, older women on long-stay wards. By contrast, hypersexuality might have been interpreted as a temporary symptom of the more treatable illnesses experienced by women who were protected in locked wards until that acute stage of their condition had passed and they could be discharged back to family life. So it appears that women who were sexually activated and not locked into wards were not given adequate information, contraception and protection due to the general, amongst other reasons, but here I'm arguing, due to the general distaste and embarrassment felt by some staff who preferred to avoid having to deal with patient sexuality at any level. Thank you.